I'm PJ O'Neill, serving as branch chief in STEM training and youth programs. Welcome to this month's Tech Talk, Lessons Learned from Boating Accidents. Tech Talks are sponsored by the U.S. Coast Guard, Coast Guard Auxiliary, and the Boy Scouts of America Sea Scout program. Tech Talks are held on the fourth Tuesday of the month at 2100 hours Eastern. Just a reminder, this Tech Talk is being recorded and will be posted on both the Sea Scout and AuxScout YouTube channels. Please subscribe to the YouTube channels and share with your shipmates that could not join us live tonight. The recorded Tech Talks make excellent training for your Sea Scout ship or auxiliary flotilla. So again, subscribe to the YouTube channel so that you don't miss out on any of the excellent on-demand training. If you have questions during the Tech Talk, please type them in the Q&A box, which is at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we'll take up the questions at the end of the presentation. I'd like to introduce tonight's subject matter expert, Dr. Robin Pope. He's the Deputy Director of the U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary's RBS Recreational Boating Outreach Directorate. Dr. Pope has more than 3 decades of experience in paddling education and holds the American Canoe Association's highest possible instructor ratings, both in swiftwater rescue and whitewater kayaking, and has been named a Legend of Paddling by the ACA. Dr. Pope is no stranger to the Tech Talks, but tonight his presentation is beyond paddlecraft safety, and he's going to teach us about his research and lessons learned from boating accidents. So I'd like to hand it off to Dr. Robin Pope.
PJ, thank you. And as PJ said, tonight's discussion is going to be about lessons learned from boating accident reports. The objectives for tonight's talk are first to review some of the common types of fatal recreational boating accidents and why they happen, what their causes are. We then want to look at 11 different cases using that information to evaluate the reports, and then use those cases as a way to highlight the importance of some fundamental principles that are taught by boating safety groups such as Sea Scouts, the Coast Guard, and the Coast Guard Auxiliary. This is the 5th presentation on all these lines as part of a Sea Scout talk. And the more that I do these, the more that I think it's important to come back to the principles that are on this page, why we're bothering with this work. And we're talking about boating fatalities, and I want to be upfront about that. We're talking about people who have died while on the water. We do this because I believe we can learn from these tragedies that have happened to others and then use that information to keep those tragedies from happening again. That's important because each tragedy represents someone's friend or loved one or family member whose voice has been taken from them. And by reviewing their stories, we give them a voice again. And as we look at their stories, we need to remember that that voice we give them will never, ever lie, but we might misinterpret what it has to say. So in previous talks, I've tried to look at a big picture view, try to look at data on a community or population level. But to really understand the data, we need to go from that down to an individual level and see how the community and population level stories mesh up with individual stories. And by doing that, we have the best hope of an accurate interpretation and being able to do things to prevent tragedies from happening to other boaters. So, common recreational boating fatalities. Most, and as I said here, but not all, and it's important to remember, most is not all of them. Most recreational boating deaths are due to drowning. Most occur because someone unexpectedly enters the water after capsizing or falling overboard. Most occur to boaters who never have had any type of boating education, and most happen to boaters who are not wearing a life jacket. And we know that if someone falls overboard because they don't know how to handle their boat, they're not wearing a life jacket, and on top of that, they don't know how to swim, we're likely to have a bad outcome. But as you'll see in the case reports I go through, that's not always the case. Sometimes people may have one or more of these factors and still do okay. The story that I just gave you is about most vessels, but it's also important to remember that a couple vessels are different. Personal watercraft are unusual because the most common fatal accident type isn't getting into the water unexpectedly, it's having some type of collision. Most of the subjects who die are wearing a life jacket, and they die not due to drowning, but because of traumatic injury. And then the statistic that still baffles me, on pontoon boats, nearly half of the deaths are associated with voluntarily entering the water. So keep these thoughts in mind as we look through the individual cases. Why do the accidents happen? The common contributing factors, one of the most common is we don't know why. Unknown and other fall up as the leading category if we look at numbers between 2010 and 2019. Alcohol and drug use come in as second. Hazardous waters are third, followed by improper lookout and inattention. And here we think about inattention as you're not paying attention to what's going on. You're looking down at your phone, you're talking to other people. An improper lookout is simply not having the lookout that you need to, and they kind of overlap. Inexperience is a significant factor. Improper and overloading. If your boat's only rated for 4 people, if you put 12 in, you're going to have problems. And then bad weather. So if we think about these common factors, it's going to help us understand how to evaluate things and look at how those factors apply to individual cases. So in 2022, the vessels most commonly involved in recreational boating fatalities were open motorboats, accounting for nearly half of them, kayaks that accounted for about 15%, and then personal watercraft and pontoon boats that accounted for about 7% apiece. Let's look at some cases and use this as a way to figure out how to keep people from getting in trouble on the water. So the first case, and as I give through these cases, I'm providing details that are taken from the Coast Guard's boating accident reports, the recreational boating statistics. I've tried to provide enough detail that we can see what happened without providing so much detail that you can actually figure out which accident it was. There's one case I actually wanted to use, and there are too many paddlers who would hear about that and know exactly what happened. And I don't want to bring up bad memories. I want to use this as a way to help prevent future problems. So the first subjects, 2 subjects call 911 because their boat just capsized while they were at anchor, and they report that they're trying to swim to shore. Neither of them were wearing life jackets, and they were both found deceased. So the format that we're going to use is we'll look at why did these events happen, and I want to look at protective factors, things that would have helped them, and then contributing factors, things that hurt them. And the protective factor here is that they did have a communication device. They were able to yell for help. They had a lot of contributing factors. They weren't wearing a life jacket, cloudy weather, rough water, and they were in a small boat. It was an 18-foot boat. Rough waters mean that it's 1 to 4 foot waves. So 4-foot waves in an 18-foot boat is maybe not what I would choose. Air temperature and water temperature are pretty cold. And we don't know what their education and experience are, but we know from just general population studies that most cases where it's unknown, if you dig a little deeper, they probably didn't have any education and had limited experience. So in this case, the case happened because they had difficulty handling their boat because it wasn't an appropriate boat for the conditions. They weren't wearing a life jacket, they capsized and were unable to get to shore. So this is kind of a typical boating accident. Case number 2. This is for personal watercraft, but we could have put any other type of boat on here because every single vessel type, from airboats to stand-up paddleboards, has cases that are like this. It's a 70-year-old operator who was found alone face down by other boaters. No idea what happened. He was next to his personal watercraft. It had shut off, and he was deceased. He wasn't able to tell us what was going on. He had some significant protective factors. He was wearing a life jacket. The weather was clear and the seas were calm. Essentially flat seas. And you'd think that those conditions would help protect him. But those factors were outweighed by the contributing factors here. The first one was that he was boating alone. He had some kind of problem and there was nobody there to help him. He was 70 years old, and as someone who's getting closer to 70 every day, we realize that the older you get, the more likely you are to have a sudden medical condition. His blood alcohol content was 0.21. Legal limit for driving is 0.08, and that might be too high. At 0.21, the question is, how did he not fall off the personal watercraft earlier, not why did he fall off of it? And then his education and experience are unknown. But in this case, so far as we can tell, he had some type of event that put him in the water, and then he was unable to rescue himself. He was wearing a life jacket, so he stayed at the surface. And that really makes us wonder if he was simply unable to help himself because he was intoxicated, or if he had some type of cardiac event or a seizure that made him unable to help himself. When we look at this, remember that sudden medical conditions were not in the list of potential causes, and neither was boating alone. If you don't know what a circle of death in a powerboat is, you should Google it. And we had 4 subjects that were aboard a 17.5-foot powerboat, so a fairly small John boat. The boat suddenly turned to the right, and everybody was ejected or fell overboard. And because they didn't have an engine cutoff switch, the vessel continued in circles until it ran over one of them, and they died from a propeller strike. So there were some pretty significant protective factors here. Again, clear weather and calm seas. 4 people in the group. We like to have a group so that if someone gets in trouble, they can rescue each other. The vessel operator, though, had some pretty significant contributing factors. First, he didn't have an engine cutoff switch hooked up, legally required item for new boats. And this really emphasizes that having legally required equipment isn't because we want to have a bunch of police officers going out and arresting people for equipment checks. It's because we want to make sure that people stay safe and use these legally required pieces of equipment because they make them safer. Blood alcohol content was quite elevated. And here we see that we did know the education and experience, had never taken any type of formal or informal boating education, and had less than 10 hours of experience. The accident report doesn't state how many or what the carrying capacity of the boat was, but a 17.5-foot John boat with 4 people plus the outboard engine might have been overloaded. Case 4, as a kayaker, this gets close to my heart. And in the case, we have 2 people that are kayaking. They had just purchased their boats and they put in on shore at a lake, paddled offshore, and a couple hundred feet offshore, one capsized. Their friend tried to rescue them and was unable to. As a result, the second paddler capsized. Both of them tried to swim to shore. The second paddler was able to make it and was treated for hypothermia. The first was not able to and drowned. One of the major reasons for that was, unlike the picture that we see here, they weren't wearing life jackets at all. Now, they did have clear skies. There were no alcohol or drugs involved, but no life jacket, poor swimming skills relative to conditions because they weren't able to make way. The water was pretty choppy and the wind is described as strong. They had a small group with little experience and no formal education. So again, even though there were some protective factors, the contributing factors outweighed them. If we think back to the commonly reported accident causes, poor swimming skills are not mentioned as something that is potentially life-saving, and in group size, again, is not mentioned. But here, being able to swim better, having a larger group better able to rescue might have made a huge difference. Case number 5. This is a powerboat, 2 people aboard, returning from a fishing trip, and they ran into an unmanned platform in the Gulf of Mexico. Both occupants were ejected into the water. The vessel subsequently capsized. One person was able to climb back on board. The other was found after a search. So they had some significant protective factors, clear weather and calm seas. And hopefully you're seeing that that's kind of a trend because most boating accidents happen in good conditions. That might not mean that good conditions cause them. It might just mean that there are more people out on the water then, but that's when the accidents seem to be happening. Most of the accidents that were not happening at night. This was after sundown, low visibility, and the vessel's GPS unit was recovered, and they estimated they were going between 38 and 42 miles per hour despite the low visibility. Only 2 people aboard, no life jackets worn, and they were both drinking alcohol. Even if they weren't intoxicated, and that the report doesn't give their blood alcohol concentration, alcohol affects your ability to have good judgment at a time when you should definitely have good judgment. If that hadn't happened, they might have been operating at a slower speed and avoided the unmanned immobile platform. Going back to kayaking, and you'll see that with these, I'm bouncing back and forth trying to illustrate points rather than staying with one type of vessel. So 2 people go into a river. The river is described as swiftly moving and choppy, but not necessarily whitewater. One of the paddlers has lots of experience on this particular river. The other has never been in a kayak before. And because of that, when they get to a low-head dam, similar to the one that's pictured here, he doesn't realize that he needs to get out and walk around it. The white sign up here is hung on a line that goes across the river, and it says, "Don't go past this point." Dangerous hazards beyond this. There's also signage both above and below that talk about the dangers of a low-head dam. So it's not so much in this where maybe the hazard was not seen, or at least in this particular picture, you'd be able to see the hazard. But I don't know if there was signage here. If there was, the person didn't see it. So he paddles over a low-head dam. He's caught in the backwash, this flow down here. He capsizes and is held in place. His friend was able to wade up to him from downstream and recover him, perform CPR, and that was unsuccessful. So the deceased subject had a lot of protective factors. He was wearing a life jacket. He was with an experienced boater, and the boater had some rescue skills. He was able to recover him and perform CPR. Unfortunately, those protective factors were outweighed by the boater's inexperience, lack of education, and paddling in hazardous waters. This is a case where they didn't know what they didn't know. We talk about the concept of unconscious incompetence, where you get exposed to hazards and voluntarily enter them because you simply don't realize that there's a hazard. And that's what happened here. I should go back. Talking about first aid skills. First aid skills aren't mentioned in the recreational boating statistics, but I know boaters that have been resuscitated through successful CPR. I know people that have done it, and I know more that have tried it and been unsuccessful. But I also know that if you don't try, the success rate is 0. If you do try, it's better than 0. So knowing those first aid skills are critically important for safe boating, just as an insurance policy to be able to take care of your friends and family and loved ones if you need to. Case number 7 is personal watercraft. And we talked about earlier that personal watercraft tend to run into things, and that's what happened here. One vessel was following another. The lead vessel slowed down, and the second was unable to slow in time and prevent a collision. Ramped up over the lead one, struck the boater, and he was killed. The boater that was killed had lots of protective factors. They were wearing a life jacket, they'd had good boating education, and they were pretty experienced. In addition, the weather was cloudy, and generally we might think about that as bad, but it means that you're less likely to be blinded by the sun. The contributing factors, the water was choppy. That might have made it harder to control the vessel. There was a navigation rule violation. The second personal watercraft was too close to take avoidance action, which led to the collision. And there were only 2 people in the group. A larger group might have been able to point out, hey, you're a little bit close, maybe we should move back some. That was a 2-vessel personal watercraft problem. This is a 1-vessel. The operator was following another boat, not part of his group, and he was wake jumping. And if you look at state boating rules, lots of states restrict how close you can be to another boat and jump its wake. It's kind of frowned upon because it can create some hazards. In this case, the vessel operator landed and slammed forward against the handlebars. And we get an idea that he must have been going pretty quickly because the injury apparently broke ribs, lacerated their liver, and the person died on the water due to internal bleeding. So lots of protective factors again, wearing a life jacket, experience, clear weather, could see what was going on, but no education. He was boating by himself, so no one to rescue him, and no one to say, hey, maybe what you're doing isn't the right thing. Clearly operating at an excessive speed, and the water is described as choppy, which are typically 1 foot or so waves. And when that happens, maybe the personal watercraft didn't behave the way the operator expected. So going back to kayaks, we have a subject that was kayak fishing by himself, put on the water at 5:30, last seen by anybody at 7:30, and was found deceased next to their kayak by a passing boat at 12:30. This is not the lake that it occurred on, but this gives you an idea. Clear weather, calm skies, warm water. The water temperature was 82 degrees Fahrenheit, but they were boating alone with unknown education and experience. Something happened to them. There was nobody else out there to help them, and because of that, they ran into trouble. And I mentioned the boggling factor for me about pontoon boats, so we have to have a case on that. Vessel operator gets close to shore and wants to set the anchor, thinks they're not close enough, but the water is pretty shallow, so he jumps in with the anchor and disappears under the water. The people he was with were unable to recover him, and he was later found by the fire department. Lots of protective factors here. They were close to shore. The weather was clear. The seas were calm. There was a group of people aboard the boat that jumped in and tried to save them right after. And the boater had some experience, but had no education, didn't know the water depth, wasn't wearing a life jacket, and jumped into water under those conditions without knowing how to swim. Again, lots of protective factors, but not being able to swim, not wearing a life jacket, and jumping in the water leads to serious problems. So going through those cases, I wanted to close up with this, which is a case where everybody survived. This happened recently after one of the hurricanes passed through on the East Coast. Group of children, I believe there were 4 children, all told their parents they were going to go biking. Instead, they got a raft that was designed for a pool, hopped onto a flooded creek, drifted downstream, and got stuck on downed trees. And any whitewater paddler or moving water paddler looks at this and it makes their skin crawl. We know that strainers, that debris piles, such as the one pictured here, are really, really dangerous. And you can see a boat here stuck under one. These kids had better luck, though. A nearby family heard them yelling for help, called 911, and the local fire department with their swiftwater rescue team was able to get out and save all of them. They didn't have any protective factors. They did everything wrong. They all should have had a bad outcome. They had no experience, no boating education, no life jackets. There was debris in the water and the water level was high. Despite that, they all survived. And that stresses that good luck matters. And it means that if we're in a situation dealing with somebody who's in a bad situation, somebody who's in trouble, we need to really try to affect the rescue. We don't want to give up on them. And by the same token, if we're ever that person in trouble, we don't ever want to give up. We want to keep struggling to survive, to get through the situation so that we can go home. So some take-home messages that probably are not clear from looking at community level data, but really jump out at me after reviewing these individual accident cases. First, although hazardous waters are a common contributing factor, most recreational boating deaths occur in calm waters. Bad weather is a common contributing factor, but most accidents occur in good weather. And as I said earlier, that's likely because there are just more people on the water. If the weather's good and the water's calm, we tend to go out. If the weather's foul and the water's really rough, we tend to stay home. Said alcohol and drug use are common contributing factors, but many accidents don't involve them. Alcohol and drug use account for less than 20% of contributing factors. So there are lots of times that they're not involved at all. Some major take-home messages that maybe aren't brought up in the boating accident statistics. And the first is boat in a group. Boating alone increases your risk. It's more fun to have people that you can share the experience with. It's much safer to have people nearby who can help you if you get into trouble. As I said, the group increases the potential to make a save without calling for help. And if somebody's underwater, being able to make a save without waiting for the fire department to get there an hour later is pretty important. In the paddling world, we think about groups of 4 to 7. And that group is small enough that we can keep track of everyone, but large enough to be a rescue resource. If it's fewer than that, and 3 is considered the minimum, but the smaller group you get, the more likely that you're not going to be able to help. And if you get much over 7 or 8, you tend to split up into small groups anyway. And if you had 12 people, for example, it would make sense that you would split up into 2 groups of 6. But what we sometimes see is you end up with a group of 2 and 2 groups of 5. So with large groups, it's important to assign that group size so that people do get the support they need. We saw some cases where people were just found alongside their boat, and some of them had medical issues. It's important to remember that swimming is hard, and if you're scared and panicking, it's even harder. That can stress your heart, and if you have some underlying conditions, it can cause a disastrous outcome. I didn't present it here, but there are a number of accidents where someone had a documented seizure history and were found in the water. If you have a seizure on land and you fall to the ground, you might break a bone, you might have other problems, but you can breathe. If you have a seizure on the water and fall face down, then that can easily be fatal. Which means that sudden medical conditions, even though they account for a tiny fraction of boating deaths, may be indirectly responsible for others. Kind of jumping topics, legally required equipment is required for a reason. Engine cutoff switch would have prevented one of the fatalities presented here. Wearing a life jacket probably would have prevented some of the fatalities presented here. Having a signaling device might have prevented some of them. So the legally required equipment is there to make us safer. We didn't mention float plans, and float plans are not discussed in boating statistics, but every course I've taken or taught, we talk about float plans because they help ensure that somebody comes looking for you if you're ever due. None of the boating accidents here had a float plan. Looking into the accident reports, even if they did have a float plan, they weren't found because of the float plan being implemented. So why is it important? Well, first, if something does happen, it means that you've got somebody to come look for you, but just the work in doing the planning to prepare the float plan probably reduces the risk of fatality. If you take a few minutes, look at how you're going to go boating, where you're going to go boating, figure out some of the common hazards and how you're going to deal with them, you're less likely have to respond to them. And then life jackets and education. We talk about these as absolutely protective, but people who've had education have had bad problems, and life jackets protect against many fatalities, but not all of them. In calm water with kayaks, 17% of drownings, 17% of the drownings that occur in calm water occur to people wearing a life jacket. By the time we get up to very rough water, which is defined as waves greater than 4 feet, 60% of the people who die while they're boating or die while they're kayaking are wearing a life jacket. So life jackets make a huge difference, but they don't absolutely protect us. Education has a similar finding. People who take boating education are less likely to have problems, but it doesn't guarantee they won't. The important thing here, though, is putting into practice what's taught in a boating education class. Taking the class and not doing anything with it doesn't do much. Taking the class and really taking the message to heart provides a lot of protection. So, kind of some final take home messages. Every fatality, every case we talked about, the people involved planned to have a good day on the water. They all had at least one protective factor, and except for the ones in the last group who survived, which emphasizes that luck matters. In the fatal accidents, every person involved had opportunities to prevent the accident. And that means that boating fatalities are in almost every situation preventable. And our job is to help make sure that happens. One way to do that is to learn from these tragedies. Recognize that boating safety is multi-layered. When we go outside and it's cold, we talk about layering up. When we talk about boating safety, we can also layer up. Take a class, boat in a group, check the weather, make sure you know how to handle a boat, wear a life jacket, dress to swim. That gets a nice thick layer of protection. So if one thing goes wrong, we've got other things to take care of us. And our final take home message is that boating is fun. Safer boating is more fun. Focus on these tragedies so they don't happen to you. And I'll be happy to answer any questions. And I'm going to stop sharing here.
Well, thank you, Robin, for walking us through those simple but highly effective real-life case studies to really emphasize, as we had discussed earlier, mission number one, RBS, recreational boating safety. Here's a question more related to your use of the case studies. They're very clean and concise and well presented, but I'm sure that that presentation comes from a much wider array of data. And
Yes.
so just curious, how do you find the incidents that you're going to develop into a case study to teach us with?
I'm doing some work with the Coast Guard's Boating Safety Division, the Office of Boating Safety, and their lead statistician has shared some of the reports that are available. All the reports that I've been given were redacted. There's no name in them. There's no personally identifying information. And the research that I'm doing, I've gone through all of the reports, pulled out the fatal reports, and just read down the accidents. What I found surprising was when I was asked to do this talk, I was halfway through that, and I just started looking at it, looking for kind of common factors. And the next 10 accident reports that I read were all things that could have been in this talk. About half of them ended up in here, but it didn't take long to find accidents that were interesting. It's a horrible way to describe fatalities, but the events surrounding them weren't just simple things where somebody made a single mistake and had a bad outcome. There were multiple things going on, and some of them potentially protected the victim.
Right. And so you said boating is multi-layered, and
Yes.
when things go wrong, it may not just be one unique or distinct cause.
Yes.
I'm kind of to the point of the data and the statistics among the redacted type information. Is there information available on the age of boaters? I noticed there was some information on the experience level of some boaters regarding either education or hours, on the particular river.
Right.
But is there any indication that where age plays into?
Age was included in all of these, and I left that out to kind of reduce the identifiability of the subjects. All of these were adults. Some of them were older adults, the 70-year-old gentleman, but all of them were adults. All of them were over 18, except for that last group that I mentioned that survived.
Right. Great. And I do have to commend you on the care and respect with which you handle these case studies, because as you open the talk with that, we are talking about real people and someone's loved one. So
Thank you.
excellent job. Um, so curious from, say, an instructional point of view, do you think it's appropriate to use a case study type model like this when doing something like a public education course? Or is it better for the instructor to be educated for their own knowledge and to develop
Mhm.
as an instructor, but not necessarily use information like this in a course?
I think it depends on the audience and depends on their experience and maturity level. I remember teaching a course many years ago and putting up a safety presentation that wasn't as in-depth as this, but it talked about bad things that could happen to people. And all the beginning students walked out bug-eyed and
Mhm.
scared. That was a mistake on my part. I think that using these illustrative points with a beginner group, just say, we want you to be safe, which helps you have fun. And we know from data that wearing your life jacket, taking a class, dressing to swim makes a big difference. If that student then comes up and says, well, how do you know that? Then that person might benefit from a few stories. Um, I try I would rather give positive stories rather than these negative stories. So, saved by the jacket type stories, which is why I closed up with the survival story.
Yeah, that is a really good and uplifting and kind of
Yeah.
unexpected um,
Uh,
way to end your presentation.
yeah.
That was really incredible, Ed Lucky.
Yeah. When I heard that, the person telling it to me didn't tell me what happened at the end. And I expected just a horror story. And when they said that everybody survived, it was really surprising, but great.
Yeah, that is good. Um, Something that really struck when you were talking about the legally required devices, such as the cutoff switch,
Mhm.
kind of reminded me that many of us that do vessel safety checks will try to use the vessel safety check as an opportunity not to just check all of the legally required equipment and suggested equipment, but as an opportunity for education. And so I think what you just spoke about, you wouldn't have to
Yeah.
necessarily talk about specific cases,
Mhm.
but it could be useful um, in explaining, well, why do we check for these, right? We're not
Right.
trying to ding people for not
Mhm.
having this or that on their boat, but there's a reason, and the reason is for
Right.
safety.
Yes.
So um, that's certainly a takeaway, I think, for anyone that does vessel safety checks or exams,
Yeah.
where you
Cool.
could kind of internalize this knowledge, and it helps you also educate the boat owner as well.
Right. And I think that's a key part of a vessel safety check. We're not doing these to penalize people. We're doing them to help educate. And I mean, we're not law enforcement officers. We have no ability to penalize. And I don't want that ability. But if we do a good job, if law enforcement officers do show up and look at them, it protects them somewhat. But it also means they know why they're carrying the equipment and hopefully they know how to use it and why it's there.
Yeah, excellent point. I don't see any more questions, but again, I want to commend you on an excellent presentation that really gives us a why behind the recreational boating safety mission that we're all heavily invested in. This is why we do it. We look at what has gone wrong and um, realize that the mission never ends. And in all of your take-home messages, it connects right back to mission number one. So thank you very much, Dr. Pope, for sharing your research and advice with us tonight.
Mhm.
Uh, we hope to have you back again in the future as you
Sure.
continue and have more to share with the auxiliary and the Sea Scouts and all all boaters at large. And for everyone who joined us tonight, thank you very much. And we hope to see you September 23rd. Have a good evening, everyone.
Good night.